So they started in Europe. They got every country in Europe. They got North America, and they even got some countries in the global South. And they asked them the same questions across these different groups. And what they found was that there was a big difference between the rich countries and the poor countries, right? And the post-materialist thesis is just that. If a country moves beyond a concern with material goods, right? The idea that if you don't have to worry every day about putting food on the table, then your life opens up to think about what your larger values are, right? And that could include issues like human rights, issues like women's equality, and including tolerance toward homosexuality. And so the idea is that richer countries have more tolerant attitudes, and poorer countries are sort of left behind, still concerned with their material needs, and don't really have the time of day to read up on scholarly stuff on lesbian and gay rights. Yeah?
So with the last ever-changing, seeing how back in the day it was less acceptable, now in today's time it's more acceptable. That's is it saying that there can never be a set standard for anything?
Yes, I think it would say that, right? That our attitudes are never set or concrete, or they're never unchanging, right? But they're constantly being developed and reassessed, and every generation sort of thinks about how their parents did it and thinks about it new. And either their life is very much like their parents, and so their attitudes are very much the same as their parents, or like us, we live in a time where we have great differences in our social world than our parents and grandparents did, and this is the kind of setting, this post-materialist setting, where you see attitudes changing. So yeah, always changing, be the idea. Okay. So the way that they sort of proved this post-materialist thesis, that richer countries are more accepting, poorer countries are not, is to look at a measure of national wealth. Right, so the measure that we use to look at that is gross domestic product, right? Fairly standard economic measure that says basically how much economic production is happening in a country, and then we divide it by the number of people so you can compare across countries, right? And so Ron Eaglehart and some co-authors have showed that as national wealth increases, right, tolerance increases toward women's rights, toward lesbian and gay rights, toward human rights in general, right? Okay. So I'm just going to skip quickly past the next slide, if you'll forgive me. This is just talking about the data and how they know this. Okay, so that's the question that we are measuring, right? A question on the survey that's once again asked in every country. It's worded this way. Please tell me for each of the following statements whether you think it can always be justified, never be justified, or something in between. And then there's a whole long list of different kinds of things that people are supposed to give their opinion about, and homosexuality is one of them. You might rightly criticize this wording, right? This idea of homosexuality being justified or not. It might be confusing. It might be not exactly the way you would write a question. And those are valid criticisms, but the part that we're looking for in cross-national comparison is consistency across countries. So this survey has that, and so that's something that it's an equally bad question in all countries. So it should be about the same, everywhere. Okay, so let me just give you the scores, because I'm sure you're curious as to how countries rank. So these are the countries that we looked at in Europe and North America. And you can find Canada. Does this have a little laser there? Yeah. So you can find Canada there, ranked not at the very top, where, like in the Netherlands, where over 90% answered that question in a way that was, I think, over 5, so that they were on the justifiable side. And Canada is there at 69.2. And let me see if I can find our neighbor. The USA is less tolerant, as you may have guessed. Is that what you would have guessed? That Canada is more tolerant than the U.S., but maybe you wouldn't have guessed that France was also less tolerant than Canada, right? We kind of have some cultural ideas that France is like very liberal in its attitude, but on this measure, not so much. Okay. Okay. So this, as I mentioned, the post-materialist thesis was an idea developed by political scientists, and my colleague and I felt that it was missing something, right? If the idea is that GDP per capita makes a country rich, so we live like in Canada in a rich country, right? And then, so we're all supposedly relieved from our material needs, and in this post-materialist state that we can all, have time to read books and think about our ideas and our values. We thought that this was moving too quickly past a question of inequality, right? Sociologists know that even in Canada and in the U.S. and even in the richest nations in the world, not everyone has all kinds of stuff. Right? We know that poverty exists here and poverty exists throughout the world, and that inequality and the unequal distribution of that GDP per capita might interfere with this sort of post-materialist growth that Engelhardt suggested. And so that was the question that we asked, that we wanted to add to this understanding of what causes attitudes toward homosexuality. What about inequality, right? We know that GDP per capita, it's divided equally, right? You take the GDP, you divide it by the number of people, everybody gets their share. Or like our GDP per capita here is like somewhere around $30,000 a year of productivity, and but not everyone has their $30,000, right? Some people have loads more, and other people have much less, and so it's not distributed equally. So does where you fall in the social ladder affect how much tolerance toward homosexuality you have? Okay. Also, inequality varies across countries, right? So in a place like Canada, there is a medium amount of inequality. Other countries have much higher inequalities, and some countries have much lower inequalities. Right? And this is the result primarily of the kinds of social policies that national governments put in place to take care of poor people, to tax the rich, etc., etc. And so there's a good deal of variation of how much inequality across countries, and we're wondering if the overall level of inequality in a country affects tolerance toward homosexuality. Right? And so, now let me tell you a little bit about what we found. We found that, in fact, in addressing the first question, that yes, class does matter, right? Social class matters. We put a 4-class model. Now, you probably talked in your inequality class about lots of different ways to capture social class. We're going to have to set that discussion aside for right now, and you just go with me that we used a 4-class model. That would be a class that was tied to what kind of work people do, which is one of the ways that you can measure social class. So we put people into 4 classes: people who are managers, people who are professionals, right, like professors and lawyers and doctors, etc. People who are routine, non-manual workers, right? So this would capture kind of office workers that are not managers, sort of run-of-the-mill, kind of indoor workers, right? Non-manual workers. And then we have the traditional, oops, oh no, I gave you away the results. But and then we have manual workers who would be the traditional working class, people who work in factories, people who do farm labor, people who work with their hands, right? The blue-collar class. Okay. So what we found was that class matters. I'm going to explain this graph. Don't freak out. There. So you'll see this. Let me explain what we have here. We have a chart that shows on this side here how much tolerance. The higher up on the chart, the more tolerant toward homosexuality your country is. This measures by country. And along this axis here, we have how rich, right? So this country is very rich and very tolerant, right? Over here we have rich and tolerant. Over here we have poor and intolerant. And you can see that the post-materialist thesis is at play here. As countries get richer, right? These lines go up. Overall, on average, they get more tolerant, right? And so, but when you break it down by class, the way that we have here, you see that that tolerance isn't spread evenly throughout the population. What class of work you do does affect how much tolerance your group has overall. So probably the biggest, let's just talk about the two ends here. The traditional working class, right, this line right here, has the most negative attitudes toward homosexuality, right? People who work with their hands, blue-collar labor, right? And once again, we might think about cultures of masculinity or other kinds of reasons for this. But one of the reasons for this is the low wages, right? And we have the most tolerant group would be professionals, right? People with advanced degrees who have are lucky enough to be in the professions as a line of work. You might we expected maybe managers to be the next highest, being the next most privileged group. We didn't find that to be the case. That group of routine non-manual, so people like telemarketers, people who do work with their brains and with communication, usually in offices. That setting apparently, produces tolerant attitudes as well over managers who are going to have people to supervise, but be spread throughout the working world. Okay. So we know that inequality has this effect, right? We also know, let me pause here for a second. Do you have questions? I know it's hard to get from a graph, so let me take a question.